I would suggest the book we're primarily covering today is Temples of Enterprise, and it's Michael Hudson's book. It's his most recent book. And the importance of this is a huge book in terms of taking down what are the deficiencies, and it's the whole theory of barter theory, of how bartering isn't the way that economics develops in the world, in the ancient world, and in our own U.S. history. And it makes for a poor foundation for economics today. It's incorrect, and we need to change that. So Michael Hudson is a leader. And what's so special, too, is Michael has been deeply involved on a scholarly level in the last century and all of this and up to now, and is making this material accessible to the layperson, to the common person. And it is so important for us. 25% of human history was in the early Bronze Age of 25% of human civilization, I should correct myself and say, was in the early Bronze Age. And there's a very important story there. And it's something for us that'll help us today, I believe. And it'll help us think about our fellow humans in better ways. So without further ado, we'll get into that. Speaking of deficiency theory of barter, would you care to say a few words? It's all over your book, Michael, so but maybe to give a little summary.
Well, we discussed before not only why the barter theory of money was anachronistic, but why this misunderstanding was politically motivated. And the whole analysis of the Bronze Age is all about politics. What's really at issue is the view of an economy as just a mass of individuals, each acting in their own interests, or is there a social structure to individuals and a government? The theory that was taught for the last century by economic historians who were not Assyriologists, who didn't study the Bronze Age, sat and made, and beginning in the 1870s, they said, we wealthy people, we who represent the banks and the landlords are threatened by socialism and a strong government. We don't want a strong government because a strong government would tax us and issue its own money, not use our money. How do we draw a picture of as if civilization began without any government at all? And if all governments could do would be to interfere and slow down the wonderful progress of private enterprise towards the perfection of Milton Friedman and Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and the neoliberal end of history that we finally reached. So obviously, if what they've done is exclude any concept of the role of government, including money, including debt, including the distribution of land and land tenure, and price control. Everything was ruled out, and that's sort of what you learn in economics departments. And you mentioned how I'm trying to write my articles and my books accessible to people, and that's because I'm not writing for economists. I don't think you can fix a profession that says that economies work without governments doing anything but interfering. So where we discussed in the last few lectures was how money was created to pay debts. Money wasn't used to go to the market and buy shoes or a haircut or forever. It wasn't to pay for items that were being bartered because most early economies down through medieval Europe only used money for most people once a year, and that was at harvest time. And when you'd pay the harvest, you at that point convert it into money, and you'd pay all the debts that were run up during the year. That all economies were credit economies, not barter economies. And the The debts were owed mainly to the palace and the temples and other civic institutions, more including for not exactly for taxes, but for the advance of land if you're a sharecropper, or the advance of agricultural implements to settle. And the payments for these were all set by the government. This was not price controls for the economy. The first designated prices were only for payments by the community at large to the government in payment for the debts that were owed. What you could call the private sector, what I call the communal sector, had its own prices could go up and down. They could vary for anything, but a payment of money in a standardized form was made for debts. And this was because the governments, in order to create a city, and we're going to talk about urbanization today. In order to create cities that operated, you need some kind of planning. You had account keeping. If you had the families on the land largely supporting themselves with their growing their own food, selling the surplus grain to obtain items that were produced either by the palace or by tradesmen or other people, you needed some sort of accounting by the temples and the palaces and for forward planning. If you had the role of the temples was to protect societies, war widows, war orphans, and other people that couldn't make a go of things in the normal economy. So you had to provide food for them. That required forward planning. How much food do you need? If you assign lands to produce the food, how do you assign who owes what at harvest time so that we can set it aside and distribute it every month to the institutional labor force? And in that sense, money and account keeping went together, and account keeping went together with forward planning and the organization of credit and the allocation of land tenure. And these payments were part of a socialized organization of society. And that's what we'll talk about today. You could call it socialism with Sumerian and Babylonian characteristics if you want. It wasn't socialism, it wasn't capitalism. It was something that was so different from modern societies that modernists had a hard time not just thinking of ancient society as our own society, getting into a time machine and going back in time. How would we have organized things? Sumer, Babylonia, the Bronze Age were moving from indigenous communities that were self-supporting, that had to prevent instability, and most of all, that had to organize their own credit system in a way that didn't involve creditors acting as what became an oligarchy. You needed credit to be something public in character, regulated, not something that where the debts could grow faster than the ability to pay and cause all of the problems that we have today. So what's really amazing about the Bronze Age is how they solved problems that our modern society did not solve. Today, you could look at Europe and the United States. What's the problem? That the wealthiest 1% of the population has savings that are so large that their wealth consists of holding the bottom 99% in debt. You could say it's the 10% holding the 90% in debt. But that is polarization has made the 90% poor and poor and poor as more and more of their income has to go to pay for debt service, to buy housing, for education, for medical care, for credit cards just to break even. This problem, if it had occurred in the third millennium BC and the second millennium BC, you couldn't have had civilization. You couldn't have had civilization start in a way that is organized in the way that the American and European neoliberal economies are organized today. So the theory that somehow it could have started that way, that individuals could have created their own money just by barter and people liking to use silver because it was convenient, all of that was designed to sort of prevent any attempt to realize how really different the Bronze Age was and how it solved the problems of credit and land tenure in a way that the right-wing neoliberals, the bankers and the landlords did not want to be solved today. It was, and that's why economic history in the West begins with Greece and Rome. And why does it do that? Because Greece and Rome were different from the Middle East and from all of Asia. Every Asian society before Greece and Rome had prevented merchants and bankers from becoming so rich that they disrupted society. Their interests were put at the very bottom, all the way from China to the Middle East. There was always a central authority, whether it was the what was called divine kingship in Mesopotamia, all the way to the civic authorities in China and the emperors. But Greece and Rome didn't have any central authority. It was Milton Friedman's and Margaret Thatcher's ideal. They didn't have a central government, and so what you had was an oligarchy of creditors emerging that took control of the land and impoverished the Greek and Roman economies. And we all know what happened to that. It led to feudalism. So the result is, how did other economies solve the problem? And is Western civilization just a long detour from the problems that the Bronze Age were able to solve? And now that we're having society and civilization breaking once again into two halves, the Western civilization, what Europe calls the garden, against the global majority, what they call the jungle, which is trying to solve the problems that the West cannot solve. How do they prevent creditor oligarchy from taking over, taking control of the government in their own hands, run for the bankers and the landlords? That's the challenge that the BRICS countries and the global majority have. And that's why it's worthwhile looking at the Sumer and Babylonia at the Bronze Age to see that economies don't have to be organized in the way they are today. There can be a difference. So that's the lead into our discussion.
Thank you, Michael. That was powerful. One more thing is, you had a friend and you wanted to encourage him to tell his story, and it was a similar story to you, and that was Stephen Zarlanga. And as part of the summary, we covered that in our previous interviews. And it's the lost science of money. And can you say a word or two about Zarlanga and your thoughts about his takedown of Menger and that whole story? And you've done the same thing in this book. And
Yeah. We had the same takeoff points, and before he wrote that book, he wrote an article about Menger showing that money could not have been done by barter. Who's going to produce the silver that you have? How do you avoid fake silver? And how do you get pure silver? Had to be done by the temples. All early silver, all the way from the Bronze Age to Greece and Rome, was minted in the temples. How do you get the weights for the silver, the denominations? You didn't have scales. Like, how do you go buy some vegetables or shoes with a little shekel of silver? The scale is too light. They didn't have it back then. You could only pay large amounts in silver because it was more valuable than grain and other things. So he showed how the Austrian view of credit, the anti-government, anti-socialist view of money, was wrong. And I'd wanted him to write that wonderful article as the first chapter of the science of money. But he jumped right into money itself, which his book was about, to show that governments could create money, and there was nothing inherently more inflationary about governments creating money than banks creating credit or wealthy people spending their money on goods and services. So he organized the American Monetary Institute to push that idea and develop the idea that banks really have not acted in a way that is very helpful for European and American development. And he'd urged that banks be turned back into savings banks, which is how the monetary curriculum pretends that they all are. His point was to distinguish bank credit from real money, and that was worthwhile. And he revived what was called the Chicago Plan in the 1930s, which basically was to restrict banks' credit creation to the deposits they had, and the government could create money and provide the deposits for banks making productive loans, but the government would not provide money to banks for corporate takeover loans or stock buybacks or corporate raiding or simply to bid up prices for housing. So he pointed that out in his way, and it was at his conference that I met all sorts of friends that have become friends for a long time, like Dennis Kucinich was there for a long time in his group. Steve, all sorts of
Steve
one of the people there.
Yeah.
So he had a whole group of people that were very wonderful for many years.
Okay. And next thing for working on the summary a little bit is that in Temples of Enterprise, we cover the central core being the early Bronze Age, that first 1400 years. I'll get back to that in a moment. But it goes on from 3500 BC with a lot of focus and with the main idea of debt forgiveness from antiquity to the period of Constantinople at around 1000 AD, maybe 994 is one date that comes to mind. But so during that period, the focus is from this book. Another book that Michael has is The Collapse of Antiquity here. And again, it's going to cover more in depth the downfall of civilization, if you will, and with contract law, with property versus land tenure. We'll get into that in a little bit, and debt forgiveness. We lose our sense of debt forgiveness. So those three things will be hurting society as we go. But one of the key ideas for today, though, and there'll be other future interviews, is let's really get into the early Bronze Age and what made them so special. And when you think about it, the early Bronze Age goes from 3500 BC to 2200 BC. If you give it another 100 years, we could add, say, it made it 1400 years. It would be right exactly at 25% of human history that has experienced civilization. So 25% of the time we've had human civilization was we had it in a mutual aid, mutual support, a caring society where everyone counts. And you have an authority, we'll talk about that, a supreme authority that can help set the record straight so we can all get along again. So let's get into that history a bit. And I'd like to start mentioning in around chapter 10 in Michael's book, in chapter 9, there's a discussion of the rise of urbanization. And it is the rise of urbanization. And one of the ways I think about it anthropologically is the ability to have a storage system. When you have as your urban area grows, you have a storage, and then you get into the accounting and everything. So, Michael, can we talk a bit, or could you mention a little bit about maybe the NIPER or early storage systems early urbanization, and then cross us over to Sumerian Mesopotamia and the beginning of civilization, if you could.
Well, it was more than a storage system. Obviously, in order to feed everybody, food always kept first, and the temples were basically the community's storage system. If you were a farmer, a cultivator, and you had surplus grain, basically you would all this grain was counted out on the threshing floor at harvest time. You'd pay the credits. You'd have a credit. The grain would be turned over mainly to the creditors who were the temples and the palaces. They used this grain at harvest time to support the dependent population that worked for the temples and palaces throughout the year. And the reason that the origins of economic reasoning, account keeping, money, developed in Mesopotamia was Mesopotamia was not physically and geographically like other regions. It didn't have raw materials or stone. It had very rich land that was deposited by rivers over millions of years. And the land was very good for growing crops. Because of that, very much like Ukrainian land, but it didn't have metal or stone. So the Sumerians, in order to create an economy that used metal and stone and even hardwood, had to develop foreign trade. So how do you develop foreign trade? You can't have everybody just go about foreign trade. How do you get the metals and stones? Well, you can't just go and say and conquer people like the United States would go into Syria today and grab its oil, or Iraq to grab its oil, because people would fight back and wars didn't pay. You had to develop a foreign trade system. Well, what are you going to give other societies so that they will be able to get willing to give you their copper, their tin to make bronze, their silver if you wanted to make religious ornaments, there's precious stones and luxuries. You provided textiles. And Sumer had many people. There were often wars between different Near Eastern city-states. The wars would kill men, and what are you going to do with the families? What are you going to do with the wives and the children that really couldn't just cultivate land by themselves? You develop temples to say, well, this is we're going to support everybody, and we're going to provide them in the temples, and they have a job that they can't do on the land. They can do weaving of textiles, everything from clothing to rugs, and the Sumerian temples and the palaces also would produce these textiles and other handicrafts. The handicrafts would be turned over to merchants. Some merchants worked on behalf of the temples and palaces. Other merchants were independent, and they would be assigned, let's say, 1,000 units of textiles, and say, well, in 5 years, you can make all the profits you want by trading. We'll set the prices that you'll give us in silver and bronze and other things that we need. And you can keep the profits over that. But we think, we know that you're not going to have to keep records and account keeping of every transaction you do. That would have been possible. We're assuming that giving us twice the money, the equivalent of 20% simple interest per year, you should be able to make a profit over and above this 20%. So this is profit sharing. Let's say you make 40% profit. You give us half, you keep half. So you're going to owe us money at the end of 5 years. These commercial debts were denominated in silver. And this business sector was kept separate from the rest of the economy. The agrarian cultivators on the land had problems that merchants didn't have. The merchant's problem was, well, what if we have a ship that sinks? Then do we have to pay back the debt? Well, the Sumerians had an idea, the Babylonians, that the Romans kept. If a ship is sunk, then you don't have to pay the debt. To find the creditor who finances the trade venture shares in the loss. So it's wiped out. Same thing if a caravan is attacked by Arabs. Well, okay, the creditor shares in the loss. That same principle was applied to the agrarian sector at home. And if the cultivators had a problem because there was a flooding, in Hammurabi's law said, if Adad, the storm god, creates a flood, the debts don't have to be paid. Same thing if there was a drought. Same thing if there was a military invasion. So the whole idea was to create flexibility so that debts were not irreversible. You wanted the whole constraint that the Bronze Age recognized, that we want to keep debts in line with the ability to be paid. That's what Western civilization doesn't have today. You have countries that can't pay their debts, and they're being impoverished by the International Monetary Fund's austerity programs. You have individual families that can't pay their medical debt, or even their school debts. They can lose their property. You could not have had that kind of mentality in the Bronze Age, because people would have just run away. They said, well, we can't pay all the debts, and you're going to say, okay, you become a bond servant, you go work for the temples, and or for your private, you may have a temple official who's you owe money to, and the official will pay the money. Now you're his bond servant. They would have run away. And in fact, throughout the Bronze Age, and especially the late Bronze Age, by the 14th century BC, you had a lot of runaways creating their own society or working for mercenaries. And labor was the scarce resource in the Bronze Age society. You wanted to keep labor self-supporting and there. So Sumer had to develop a whole system to create a trade surplus, to trade for the raw materials that it needed in a way that didn't turn over all of the wealth of society to merchants, as occurred in the West.
Very good, Michael. So we're going to come back to that, and we're going to get more into the trade system. But I want to give everyone who's here a special idea of the early Bronze Age so we can really feel it. And I'm gonna go back into Michael's book and read from page 159, two Roman historians, Seneca and Virgil. And I want to preface my comments. Michael has pointed out to me, we really don't know who they're referencing in this. It could be early Rome, or maybe, it's 2,000 years earlier, or about almost, or 2,000 years earlier, that the early Bronze Age is taking place. In either case, it really doesn't matter, but in early Rome, they have, in very early Rome, there is a sort of sense of property. It's not as pure a form of a mutual aid society that the Bronze Age has. But nonetheless, just to listen to their statements makes me feel, and you can decide for yourself, it makes me feel that the early Bronze Age is biblically what we're talking and thinking about when we mention in Genesis the Garden of Eden. So let me read to you these two little quotes, and I'll let you think what you will. And this is Seneca. He's from 4 BC to 65 AD. He wrote in Epsittula, 90.34 cited in Lovejoy and Boaz. But anyhow, the quote is, there was once a fortune-favored period when the boundaries of nature lay open to all for men's indiscriminate use, before avarice and luxury had broken the bonds that held mortals together. So there's something going on. There's going to be the bonds broken that are holding humans together. But at this time, the bonds are held together, what Michael is describing. I'm going to read that again and then go on to Virgil's quick 4 lines. There was once a fortune-favored period when the boundaries of nature lay open to all for men's indiscriminate use, before avarice, extreme greed, that is, avarice is extreme greed, and luxury had broken the bonds. It's greed that breaks the bonds that's held mortals together. And now Virgil, 79 to 19 BC, expressed this typical view in his Georgics. Here it is. No plowman tilled the soil, nor was it right to portion off the boundaries of property. Men shared their gain, and earth gave more freely her riches to her sons who sought them not. Again, we have.
But don't read it twice. Once is enough.
Okay.
Okay.
And
I got to say that is not history. That's poetry, and quite frankly, it's garbage. Who are the greedy people of Rome? Well, Seneca. He was a usurer. I'm sure he said, "This is a hell of a way to make money. Here I make money by lending people and reducing them to bondage. Let's make a fantasy. Let's juxtapose. What if there's the opposite of what we have today?" And he created an opposite. But that opposite should not be used as history. Again, here you did not have cultivators tilling the soil without boundaries. The Neolithic was the original economic form of organization that led to the Bronze Age. What did you have in the Neolithic? Cultivation is not like going out and hunter-gathering. It's not going out and picking crops off the trees. You have to organize planting, organize the time of harvesting. You have to organize how are you going to get by in between the planting time and the harvest time, and how are you going to organize the land? We know in retrospect how the Neolithic, all the way through classical antiquity, organized land tenure. It was standardized. Every family was designated, created enough land to support itself and the family, enough for it to, number one, feed itself, and number two, you had to, when you're not cultivating, what are you going to do? The answer is you provide the corvée labor, the labor to create the structures that we need for cities to defend ourselves. If you just have people cultivating the land, then some other tribe would just come and take it over, like the movie, The Magnificent Seven. So you needed cities. You needed protective walls. So if there was an attack, the cultivators could move into the walls. So the Neolithic communities assigned land to everybody enough, and the land was assigned in exchange for having these land rights. The cultivators had to perform corvée labor, building the city walls, building the roads or digging the canals that fertilized the land, and undertake private public projects. Every city, every urbanization needed public labor, but the labor force was on the land cultivating. You're not going to have some people build walls and that's all they do, and then the cultivators just are without work during the when it's not the planting or harvesting season. The the Neolithic had to be the organization of society. The Romans didn't know anything about the Bronze Age, and they hated the very idea of a society that was not driven on greed, because that's what they were, greedy. They could say, wouldn't it be nice if there was once upon a time there wasn't greed? But that's a fantasy, and it's not very helpful to have a fantasy like that. It's more helpful. The articles that I have in my book showing that land was created as the means of paying taxes. The taxes came first. The land tenure was a byproduct of land. It's the opposite today. Today you have the landowners or the natural resource owners saying, stop taxing us, leave us our land free of the government. But the land tenure was created by the government in order to pay taxes. First came the liability, then the land tenure rights that were conditional upon the laborers providing the public services that were needed in order to have civilization and cities and urbanization.
Okay, very well put, Michael. And I think I got caught up in their dream, and I'll know to be more careful next time.
That's okay. It's good that you brought it up so that we know what didn't happen, and I can point out what did happen.
Thank you. Good. Well, when you talked about land for a moment here, and this is part of our system trading in our economy in the Bronze Age that we're focusing on here, and you talked about land being assigned, and I'm wondering who assigns, and which can we go back to? In early urbanization, we have chiefs. But what's developing with civilization, we have more administrators. The palace has to find the talent, and they have to get the accountants, and they have to get people who can plan ahead, the forward planning and the thinking. And but as we get into that, can you mention a little bit land tenure? Who is it? How is the land being parsed out to people in that type of society?
Well, originally there had to be a kind of communal government. They all you had to have people agree on what would be a fair distribution of land. Because again, suppose that you had some people wanting to take over the land. Then if they took over all the land, people would run away. And actually, this you can explain this by how Rome was founded by the kings. You know the myth of Romulus and Remus, that they set up area among the hills that was good for cultivation, and it was like a city of refuge. It was for runaways. Well, that got a little, the mythologist said, well, it could be crooks, runaways. And indeed, that seems to be the case. And the designers of Rome were very clever. They said, how are we going to get labor? How are we going to populate our city? We have this mosquito-ridden swampland. We don't want to be part of these other societies because you have selfish chieftains running them. They're mafia organizations, basically. What you had in early Greece and Rome, they were called mafias, little mafia chieftains, and people are running away. So essentially, you had the kings of Rome say, we have a way of getting population. You folks in northern Italy and oppressed to the south, oppressed places, you can come and join us, and we will assign you land. We'll give you a standardized 7 or 9 jugera of land, enough for you to support yourself, and you can become our citizens because we need your labor and we need you to serve in the army. If you're going to be assigned land, Just like in Mesopotamia, you have to serve in the army. That's one of the things that I didn't mention before. And in addition to serving in the army, you have to help us build city walls and do the infrastructure we need. And so, but we're not going to reduce you to bondage. We're going to create a society here in Rome that doesn't have a creditor class that's going to say, well, if you don't pay your rents to us, and the rent debts and the money debts you owe us, you're going to become our slaves. You can be free, but because we can use your labor, quite frankly. And so that's how Rome developed for the first few centuries of its existence. Well, finally, in the late 7th century, you had not only laborers running away, but you had some wealthy people, individuals getting in fights with other wealthy families, and they fled to Rome. And they brought their wealth and their gangs with them, their retainers, their slaves with them. And the oligarchy finally got together and overthrew the kings of Rome and made Rome into an oligarchy. That didn't happen in the Neolithic, and it didn't happen in the Bronze Age, but the idea was there. Every community wanted labor, and you had to you had to standardize labor. The essence of cities and urbanization and civilization was standardization. You have a standard allotment of land. That land has a standard tax to it. You have to work on corvée labor for a given number of days. And if there's a military emergency, you have to serve in the army. Well, you have many pictures from Sumerian times, Babylonian times, about workers carrying big bags of stone and things, carrying stones, carrying raw materials that you need to build city walls or to dig irrigation ditches and move the land away to build the temple ziggurats, the temple pyramids that they had. You needed all that. How do you get people to do this? Because you'd think not everybody wants to spend their time as a manual laborer on a construction project. Today, you have immigrants that do that in America. Well, what you did was you organized this as a kind of community building. And in one of our volumes, Labor in the Ancient World, we show that this is how the pyramids were built. We have the documentation for the account keeping for the pyramids. What they have is a number of things. A lot of beer. If you're going to work on a building project, we're going to have a big beer party. And we're also going to have a lot of distributed meat. We have herds of cattle, and we know that on the land, not everybody has a cow or a goat or cattle. We're going to really we're going to have a feast. We're probably going to sing songs. We're going to have entertainment. This was how they built their, let's call it patriotism, you can say. And so they made the corvée labor not into saying, we're going to treat you like slaves of the state, build pyramids. We know from the carvings on the inside of the pyramid stones, they will say, we're the stone carvers from such and such a city. We're very proud to be here from our local labor union. And they were, we know what they were remunerated, and it was pretty high. They were well paid, well fed, well supported labor, just the opposite of what the Bible says, and just the opposite of what right-wing historians that say, oh, any state is oppressive. You have a state, you're going to be like the pharaohs, enslaving everyone to make pyramids. That's not how it occurred. That's just plain propaganda.
Okay, and in keeping good citizens then too, and back in Sumeria, but we could talk about Egypt or after Sumeria, the Babylon area time. what happens with land? And you're talking about assigning land, working the land, but it's not quite property, is it? It's land tenure. Can you go into that a little bit?
Land was assigned. It was a public utility. And everybody, the whole idea was to provide the population with the means of livelihood. You didn't want populations to be dependent on the state because there wasn't a state in existence to support them at that point. All you wanted to say, how do we make our community independent and resilient? How do we survive? Well, you survive by providing everybody with an assignment of the land in exchange for responsibilities and liabilities. The land was defined by its liability. So if you were a family of such and such a size with men, a given number of men who could serve in the army or work on infrastructure in the corvée when they weren't doing that, when they weren't doing the harvesting, that was their liability. And if you didn't pay, if you didn't perform these social obligations, then you lost your right to hold the land. So everybody had rights to the land in exchange for the liability. If they didn't pay their obligations, they lost it. Land was a public utility. Just like in modern times, we have, well, what's public? In many state countries, the right to an education, that's free. The right to water is free. The healthcare is free. There are all sorts of basic needs that are free, and the ability to support yourself on your own land was something that was free with obligations to society that assigned you this means of self-support and guaranteed you this means of self-support.
Mhm. Michael, given that I got it wrong in terms of going into Seneca and Virgil,
No,
but
they got it wrong. You were right to bring it up, to juxtapose that
right.
only a greedy society could fantasize that way.
Well, then let's hear for you to fantasize. How it seems like everything you're about, debt forgiveness and everything, if we were looking at historically best practices, we would be going back to the ancient Near East and Mesopotamia. Also in your book is the idea, and Michael mentioned it before a little bit ago, is there it was indeed early on, there was like an attempt maybe to conquer some land, but that was a nasty business. It was much better to trade, yes, war, no. And I, how it seems like it's a pretty good time. And if you were to be alive again, would you be wanting to pick the early Bronze Age? What advantages might we have thinking about that? And then how would you relate that to the Bible later in terms of it being something what I've maybe called the Garden of Eden? Could you say a little bit about the early Bronze Age and your sentiments about it?
Well, it wasn't very easy to live then. I'd rather live now with toilets that flush and going out to restaurants and being able to travel a lot. It was a hard life. The Neolithic Revolution didn't make things easier than hunting and gathering were. Hunting and gathering is easy. Cultivating really takes a lot of hard work, and that was what was necessary to survive. Had to be organized. We have the salaries of the administrators, that you mentioned earlier, all the way down to cultivators. The Bronze Age salaries were as unequal as they are between modern corporate executives and their labor force. It was not an egalitarian society. It was a highly stratified society. The merchants were very rich. You had some individuals who were able to accumulate large amounts of wealth, large amounts of land. But the important thing is that they didn't create dynasties that became a self-supporting oligarchy oppressing the rest. It was very much like you'd have wealthy billionaires emerging in China today. You would have wealthy people developing, but somehow they didn't have this. And you could get rich by having people in debt to you, but then a ruler would come along and say, a new king would take the throne. And the first thing that every king did at his inauguration, from Sumer to Babylonia, all through the early Bronze Age, was to proclaim a clean slate. He'd say, okay, with my rule, we're having the economies reborn. We're going to date our economy just like England dated all of its years, like from the new king or the queen, year 1, 2, 3 of Elizabeth, 1, 2, 3 of James, or whoever the king or the queen was. You would have the dating from the time of the new king, and from the second year, namely the first full year on the throne, you would have his proclamation of a clean slate, which was cancel the debts, liberate all of the bond servants that had been owed labor to their creditors, and you'd return the land to cultivators that had lost it to their wealthy people under economic distress. This was not circular time. But it was a return to a well-ordered society. The Babylonians had a model, an economic model, and it was more sophisticated than any model that's used by the National Bureau of Economic Research today, or what you're taught in school. And the Babylonians did not make the mistake that today's academic economists make. They didn't assume that every economy would be self-correcting and self-adjusting to debt. The Babylonians realized that societies got out of balance. And when a society would get out of balance by more and more people running up debts, more and more people, wealthy people, getting control over debtors and control over their land, that would lead to social impoverishment, runaways, and what the rulers called disorder. And the role of the kings, when they took the throne, was to say, I'm restoring order. I'm restoring the distribution of land, the ability of the promise of self-support, the means of self-support to all of the population. I'm restoring the economy to the way it ought to be. That's not a golden age. That's the Bronze Age way of making sure that there was not a creditor oligarchy to develop in the way that it developed in classical Greece and Rome. It was a restoration of order. And essentially, you would have, I sent you a copy of the model. They realized that debts grew exponentially. We have the mathematical training lessons that scribes took as they were learning how to be a scribe and an accountant and a bureaucratic planner. How fast does a debt grow? Grows exponentially, like in a rising curve. But we also have plans on how fast does a herd of cattle grow. Well, it's an S curve. It tapers off. And this S curve that tapers off is not exponential. The Babylonians knew something that should be the very center of economic teaching today. It's how do you cope with the fact that debts grow faster than the economy's ability to pay? That was the guiding principle that for Babylonian, Sumerian, and other Bronze Age kingship. How do you cope with this problem? Well, the answer is you cancel the debts. You don't let them expand to the point in which you turn into a Roman-type oligarchy and lead to a Bronze Age, to a Dark Age.
Yeah.
If you let that happen, there wouldn't have been civilization.
The terms you used for that, and it's really appropriate. You talked about the idea of linear time versus circular time. And it's with the seasons that we're describing And so if there's a flood in the spring and the god of water sends things out, it's thought of in the circle of time, maybe these things happen and we got to create order again. And it's the high palace and the gods that help create order. And is there a comparison to today where we need to have faith? People back then had faith in the higher order of the palace, it seems. And but today we don't have a source for that higher order where we can put our faith, our best. Any thoughts there, Michael?
Well, yes, the point is that our democracies are not able to cope with the debt problem and economic polarization that the Bronze Age rulers were able to cope with. You need a strong enough government to prevent polarization. And I want to go back to your, you and me and other people have talked circular time and linear time. That's not really the best terminology. What a circular time means reversible. You go back to the beginning. You reverse the inequities and you get rid of them. Linear time is irreversible. That's what you had in Rome. Once in Rome and Greece and in the West, once you ran into debt, you couldn't cancel it. You just fell into bondage and became a slave. Once you lost your land, you lost it forever. Nobody's going to give it back to you. It's not reversible. So you had a wealthy class emerge that made its gravitization, as they say in Russia, irreversible. And that's a problem that Western civilization has today, the irreversibility of inequality. Well, the modern, in a way, this is like a new year. There was throughout Asia, for instance, for thousands of years, the New Year was celebrated as a new beginning. People would go clean their houses for New Year. They'd often be a kind of disorder, a Saturnalia celebration before, but on the New Year, okay, we're starting a new year, clean the house. People would go from door to door and pay back all of the debts that they owed. This is not a debt cancellation. This is modern Asia to do it. The Mesopotamians had a better idea of just you would create a new, well-ordered society by providing a clean slate.
Thank you, Michael.
That was the ruler that you needed a strong ruler to do it. Without a ruler, you couldn't have done it. Then you would have had the greedy creditors taking what they could, and nobody could do anything about it. The creditors would have their own army. You're my slave. You have to serve in my army. Yeah, you end up looking like feudal Europe.
Well, it's an interesting thought because there seems to be such mistrust today that there's a real breakdown, and we have a struggle with that, and we're so individualized, we're atomized that we need to become togetherized and more communal. So in many ways, I think right now we've been at it a little over an hour. And did you need, are we good to go we're good?
Yeah, we can continue. Maybe we should go to the questions.
Yeah.
I moved awfully fast. People may have questions about this.
Good. I didn't know if you had pills or something too. So if you raise your hands or I might ask Mario, if you've seen some questions out there, or to either read or to ask people if they want to ask questions, we could start working towards that.
Yeah, indeed, there have been some questions in the chat, but I don't know if they were on topic. So maybe we could first ask everyone to think about something to share with others that relates deeply to the topics raised. I myself have so many questions, but I will let
very
you,
fast. I mean,
everybody.
we've covered thousands of years here, and
Right.
there must be, how did we get from A to B or from C to D?
Yeah. So I see some of them. I will ask maybe John Howell if he wants to state out loud the question he put in the chat. Are you interested in that, John?
Sure. Uh, Michael, thanks so much for this really marvelous description of the earliest period of our sort of civilization, and the fact that community organization was essential as part of people coming together with agriculture and urbanization and so on. But I wonder, and you've stressed the fact that it required strong leadership, and it almost made me think, wait a minute, are you arguing that that we need authoritarian kind of rule at the present day as opposed to what we aspire to in terms of democracy? And I don't really think you mean that, but how do we get to the kind of a central authority that remains responsible to the community and has a democratic component?
That's the perfect question to ask. And that indeed is the question. There was a long debate over were these authoritarians or not. What there was a stratification. Everybody was subordinate to somebody above them, every single status. If you were a child, you were subordinate to the parents. If you were parents, you were subordinate to the clan leader. If you were the clan leader, you were subordinate to some civic authority, all the way up to the king. And the king was subordinate to the gods. And the king was pledged to uphold the value system that the sun god of justice, would provide. And you have on Hammurabi's stele the picture of him either showing his laws to the sun god looking down on him, Shamash, or else Shamash was giving him the laws. The ruler had to obey a religious morality that reflected the public morality. And if he didn't, he'd be overthrown. And it's very funny. If you read the official histories that were written in Babylonia, it's all about how the ruler made everybody prosperous and everybody was happy. But where you find the real facts is in the astrological diaries. You wouldn't think of going to astrology to get the answer to your question. But in astrology, they had to write everything that's happening because the Middle Eastern idea, West Asian idea of science was to correlate everything into a cosmos, and you'd have the grain prices going up and down in the diary. You would have the water levels of the Euphrates or the Nile or whatever going up and down. You would have the conjunctions or aspects between Mars, the moon, and the sun, the planets. And you would have something, I'm making up an example, if the sun is square Mars, the ruler will be overthrown. There will be a palace revolution. That's how we know that some rulers were overthrown. There was a palace revolution. The ruler himself was not allowed to be like an American Donald Trump or a crook, but like Joe Biden running things, or a deep state. You had to have, there was a public morality that everybody was supposed to share, and if rulers had to provide this because there was a check. As I mentioned, rulers, people would run away if the ruler deviated and became very selfish. You have examples in tribal, indigenous communities that anthropologists study. Chieftains are supposed to be open-handed. They're assigned extra land, and that's to support newcomers or fugitives, or they're supposed to mediate the community's wealth creation in a way for the benefit of the community. And if they don't do that, they're replaced by another chieftain. Sometimes they could even be killed, or more often they're just exiled, go somewhere else. You have that same mentality and treatment that evolved into the Bronze Age. The rulers were supposed to maintain order, and they did that not because they were not autocratic. I'm sure they were very ambitious. Militarily, certainly, we know they were ambitious, but they were not ambitious in the sense of how do we become an autocrat over the people. It is true that Assyriologists say that, well, if you did something the palace didn't like, barefoot people might come and arrest you in your sleep. So obviously, ruler you didn't want to be on the wrong side of the king. That's like being on the wrong side of Stalin. And in fact, there are a lot of to read Hammurabi's year names. It will be, this is the year Hammurabi founded the canal. Hammurabi is the prosperity of the people. I can just imagine Stalin having something like that. So obviously you have every ruler depicted himself in terms of what a ruler is ideally supposed to do, and that's promote the public welfare. Many rulers must have become sort of selfish, but there was a limit to what they could do without having a revolt. And one of the constraints was, suppose that you had another Near Eastern society attack you. I think what happened in Babylonia was what we knew happened in Greece. There was a military manual that was published in the 4th century under the name of Tacticus. And it's a guide for how to attack or defend cities. How do you attack a city? You promise to free the slaves and to cancel everybody's debts. How do you defend a city? You promise that if you defend the city and we're free, we're going to at least cancel everybody's debts. That must have been the case in Babylonia. If you have a ruler that was an autocrat, somebody would attack and the army said, well, you can't be worse than what we have. Welcome. I think that was the constraint on just how authoritarian you could be. The army, you needed the army, and the army were the cultivators. You needed the army on your side.
You describe a society essentially that was highly structured, that essentially didn't give opportunities for people to move between these layers, presumably.
I don't know. No, I don't know. They could be a merchant and make money. There must have been ways of making in classical antiquity, it would be to become a sportsman or something. There must have been an opportunity.
The palace has to find
and one way of assuring them opportunity, there wasn't hereditary wealth in a dynasty. When somebody, you don't have hereditary fortunes occurring in Sumer and Babylonia. So and this was again like the indigenous societies. What do you do if in a tribal society, if an individual gets wealthy? Do you want him to give his wealth to his family and let his family end up lording it over society? Well, one way to do it would be to bury the wealth with him. At least if you bury it, it's going to be there. You commemorate him, and the family doesn't get it. All early archaic societies seem to have prevented the inheritance of wealth that would have built up a source of inequality within society. So that was one way of preventing this. And we know that very often outsiders were picked as kings. Of course, there was mobility. Usually, if somebody was very tall and a good fighter, stood out in the crowd, he'd be appointed king. I think that's how Urukagina came to power in Sumer. So yes, of course, there was mobility.
Okay, thanks. That was great.
Yeah.
I would love to give word now to Lucille that has also shared some questions in the chat. So speak your mind if you want.
Sure, thank you. So I do have a second question, but this first one was in the chat, and it comes out of just your comments at the end where you redefine linear time and circular time as irreversible and reversible. And you kind of implied that we don't have that grows exponentially, and it's not reversible today as it was back then. And the one example that occurred to me, and so I wondered, does going into bankruptcy today count as reversible, as providing a clean slate? Again, why or why not?
You have bankruptcy on a personal scale for everything except, in America, student debts. President Biden, when he was a senator for the credit card company state, Delaware, is really the corporate state, and he wanted to make sure that if labor tried to have upward mobility and go to get an education, they were going into a lifetime of debt bondage. He wanted to make sure that there would not be economic mobility of being able to wipe out debts to his backers, the credit card companies and the banks. He was a thug working for the banks and the credit card companies and said, once they're in debt, we want the creditors to get more and more money. We want to keep labor down because that's what my backers, the corporate sector of Delaware, wants. So the whole idea in America is to prevent upward mobility. You want to prevent rising in the most mobility in America is to get a home. That's a badge of being the middle class. The Obama-Biden administration said, we've got to prevent people from rising into the middle class. We've just had the banks create a crooked junk mortgage crisis. I promised to wipe out the bad mortgages, but instead I'm going to expropriate 8 million American families who owe the money to the banks. And we're going to give enough money to the banks that, they didn't lose any money on their enormous fraud. I'm going to create a new pro-bank system in 2008 that in 10 years is going to reduce home ownership by 10 percentage points in the United States. I'm going to create an economy, Biden and myself, that there will be less and less and less homeownership, and we're going to turn America into a landlord society. So this is not the idea of a clean slate. This is the road to debt peonage.
Michael, just let me continue. I know you got a second question, but it's an add-on to this.
It sounded like Lucille had a follow-up.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, but this is a debt one. Esther Taylor in the New Republic yesterday is calling on Biden to sign a debt forgiveness of all student loans. And it's something he could do before the Department of Education gets eliminated, according to the article, or according to some broadcasts. What's your sentiment there? And
he'd be glad to do that because he knows it would be overturned and it couldn't, the courts would overturn it and he couldn't really do it. He wants to pretend to do something that everybody wants, but in a way that it doesn't work. So you can always pretend to support people as long as you know that it's just pretend. Talk of a golden age in practice. So you can't believe a word he says.
go ahead,
That's what
Lucille.
advertising is. It's all in the narrative. Every ruler, just like in Babylonia, always said, I'm here to promote public welfare. But we have a Supreme Court to make sure you're not going to be able to get it.
Thank you. Yeah, really, really helpful answers, Michael, both to my question and Stephen's just now. My other question was, you said it's not possible for debts not to grow exponentially. And so my question is, and it's out of the AMI and Alliance for Just Money and IMMR context, from your point of view, is it possible to have a public money system today in which debt does not grow exponentially? If not, why not? And if so, how and how do we get there?
Well, to paraphrase Mayor Johnson of Cleveland, if society doesn't control the money system will control society. Who's going to come first? Of course, there should be public money, and that's what makes China so successful and the West so unsuccessful. China, when it set up the Bank of China, was in a position very much like the United States was in the Civil War. There was, how do you get the money, to defend yourself? Well, America printed the greenbacks that funded the Civil War. Every European country created its own money in World War I in order to fight the war. But once the war was over, the bankers fought back and said, don't do this again. Let us lend you the money. If you create, the pretense is, if you create money, it'll be inflationary. But if we create money, it's not inflationary. Well, money's money. It doesn't matter who creates it. This is kind of the fiction that is taught in money and banking courses in the university, and that's what Steve Zarlenga and the AMI was created to disprove.
Okay, thanks, Lucille
Yeah.
and Hudson as well. Now we have a quick question in the chat by Virginia Hammond, which says, how do we know what we know about this period in history? So maybe you want to give us some ideas of how do we know what happened in this period of history? What kind of sources or information do you use to kind of understand how these societies work?
Babylonia was a very well-documented economy, and the documentation was on clay tablets that didn't burn up. They survived much better than papyri or paper tablets. And at the end of the accounting year, what would you do with all the tablets? Well, you'd throw them away. We have all of the junk piles of all the tablets, and that's how they've reconstructed a lot of the detail. Private archives, when families would keep their inheritance, their marriage contracts, their letters to each other, they would all be in private archives that were all kept together and ended up being buried. And we have the public announcements of rulers, the proclamations, the laws, and we have the lawsuits that were brought. Someone would say, this creditor is saying that I owe him money, but there was a debt cancellation, and he's saying, I'm not going to obey it. What's going to do? The courts would say, the creditor would say, well, he promised, he signed something, say, if there's a debt cancellation, I still owe you the money. The courts would said, well, that doesn't count. You can't do that. When the ruler has a debt cancellation, it's that. Well, this is the same problem that came up at the time of Jesus, when you had the rabbis, Hillel, proposing a special clause that by debtors, I will waive my rights under the Jubilee year. This is what the whole fight between Jesus and the Pharisees was all about, that kind of thing. We have all that document. We don't have lawsuits from Israel at that time, or Judea at that time, but we do have the lawsuits from Babylonia, so that the legal cases, the property rights, all on tablets that we can follow. There aren't enough Assyriologists to translate enough of these tablets.
Okay, thank you. So now I will give a word to Carl Golovin. Please be precise and concrete if you can.
Dr. Hudson, thank you. It's a privilege to ask you this question. Pardon me, I'm a little bit congested, so I hope I'm understandable. My question is the potential for a new Breton Woods type of arrangement. Of course, the original failed because the U.S. failed its obligation to redeem dollars that accumulated overseas in gold. If you perhaps I should ask, have you been to Iceland? I find it a uniquely civilized, developed place that's physically isolated. Multinational exchange facility were established and maintained in Iceland, where every country could keep an adequate amount of gold, were there to be new fixed exchange, perhaps periodically adjusted exchange rates among the nation's currencies. If any country's currency excessively accumulated in one's own country, there could be
slower, Carl, a little bit, and
Oh, sorry, I was feeling pressure to be quick.
No,
So
I know. If you're too quick, then I say I can't understand a word. Next question.
Well, okay, Iceland as a location for a multinational second Breton Woods facility where maintained multinationally, and again, exchange rates set between the nations for their currencies, where any country whose currency excessively accumulates in another country, that other country could use the Icelandic based located monetary exchange facility to gain credit of the other country's gold to their own account by turning in that currency. Sort of like with the original Bretton Woods, France, redeemed their dollars for our gold. This would be a more geopolitically neutral concept and arguably everyone could more or less agree to keep their hands off of Iceland because it's fairly neutral and it's isolated enough that neutrality would be enforceable.
Well, you can certainly understand why there'd be some requirement for that because in the past, the country's central banks were supposed to be honest. Especially America and England tried to be tried to be monetary centers, but they turned out to be crooks. For instance, Venezuela kept its gold in England. So that it could use when it had to support the Venezuelan exchange rate by selling gold. England, which was a financial center, would provide the gold. But then Venezuela elected someone that the United States didn't like. And America appointed someone, Guido, to his head against who the people voted for, some little-known person. And England said, we're part of NATO. And NATO, if the United States says that you voted for somebody that America doesn't like, you're not a democracy because there's only one arbiter of democracy, and that's America. So we're giving this gold to the candidate that didn't win. We're taking it away from Venezuela. You can't trust us anymore. The Americans did the same thing with Europe with Russia's gold. Russia thought that it was keeping money with central banks, and Europe said, we want to carve you up, Russia. America's at war with you, and NATO's at war with you. We're giving the gold we're selling it and giving it to the Ukraine because we find we can give them $50 billion of loan, and the leaders have agreed that if we give them this, they will buy palaces and land and stocks and bonds in the West, and they'll agree to fight to the last Ukrainian and kill the most of the male population and fight Russia, which is what we want. We're taking away your money. So, of course, you could see that Iceland would want to say, well, we're going to be the honest broker. But the fact is, they're part of Europe, and nobody is going to, the rest of the world will not trust Europe anymore. I think Iceland is probably part of NATO. I don't remember. But there is no way that you can trust any European central bank anymore because it's all an extension of the American military, the American State Department. Now, the world monetary system has been militarized. That's what my book, Super Imperialism, is all about. That's what all of my lectures on the modern economy are all about. So today, the world monetary system is an embodiment of the dollars thrown off by American military spending abroad. That's the basic system, but that's not really what the Bronze Age is all about.
I think we're good. Mario, was there any other? I think we're at our time.
Oh man, I had so many questions to ask, but it's okay. It's for another time. So no, I think we are done because it's time, and I think it's very good that we keep things on time. So
Okay, we're over time already.
Okay.
Usually, and the first two interviews, Michael had to go and eat. And I'm thinking, no, he doesn't have to eat now. We should have tried to go for 2 hours. And we'll think about that next time, but we'll see how things are, Michael. we appreciate you hugely, hugely for sharing your time with us. And if everybody wants to give a little wave to Michael, that'd be great. But just to say thank you, and we look forward to next time too. And have a great day with Grace, and you take care.
Well, I think we raised all the right issues today. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we'll get to Babylon next time in the middle Bronze Age. I think we've covered the early Bronze Age. Good. We can move one notch up now. Okay. Peace and good good mutual aid to everybody. Okay. Bye-bye for now.
Thanks to both.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Gotta go.
I'm printing out our letter from this morning because it'll help organize things a little bit.
Yeah.
But
I wanted to make a transition from our earlier broadcasts about money and credit to the urbanization and the fact that to create an urban entity, you need money and credit and all of the things that we've thought about in the past. So we can make the whole thing, if you put all the lectures together, it'll be a continuity.
Okay. And we'll do that right at the end of the summary as a transition, or when do you think?
No, I'm going to mention that when you mention credit, I thought I'd do it when you talk about the deficiency of the barter theory. Then I'm going to say that the barter theory, everything was on credit, and most credit was owed to the temples and palaces, and you have to begin. We only talked narrowly about money and credit itself and why money wasn't barter, but now how the whole system fits into a bigger whole. And the bigger whole is, how are you going to organize a society where the creditors didn't take over and become Margaret Thatcher's England?
Right.
And I'm going to call that socialism with Sumerian and Babylonian characteristics.
Okay. We got a question right beforehand too. Yesterday and we don't have to bring this up at all, but if it can be a quick question later. Astra Taylor in the New Republic yesterday is asking for Biden to have complete student debt forgiveness.
Uh-huh.
And I'm guessing you're in line with that, and you might have a few words.
All I can say is there shouldn't be any student debt at all. Education should be like it was in Europe for many years, and in China it should be a public utility without anything. And the fact that it's been privatized is what makes the American economy uncompetitive and self-destructive and post-industrial.
Thank you. Yeah, no.
If I said anything, that's what I would say.
Yeah,
but that's not this.
Either, you know what, I'm tempted to put it right at the beginning or right at the end.
Okay. Wherever you decide, you're the organizer.
Okay, thank you. Some people.
Where are you from? Are you in Chicago now, or are you somewhere else?
No, I'm Chicago, and Bo Young here is in Toronto.
I'm in Toronto, Canada.
And
I've been there.
And Mario's in Spain or in Madrid, I would guess.
No, Madrid. Santiago de Compostela. It's in the northwest, but yes.
Oh, okay.
Spain.
Santiago. Very good. Muy bien.
Okay.
I'm actually amazed of the chance to have you here, Michael. I've been following you for a long time now, and nice to have the chance to meet.
Well, what does your group do? You said IMMR.
Yeah, well, it's also money reform, but I center myself in education. And for example, I'm teaching high school kids about the history of money, the different kinds of money that there have been. And last Saturday, we talked about the barter myth, and I recall some of the examples you put in your work to talk about debt and how natural it is to use debts as something to move the economy. And we played some games, and yeah.
Stephen, will you be making a transcript of this?
Yeah, it's already happening. I'm recording. I can already Matter of fact, there's two simultaneous ones. There's one being made to the cloud and one being made to my computer. So it'll
If
be,
it's done by computer, whenever I say debt, they put in death.
oh
And
gosh.
you can see the connection, but it confuses listeners.
Okay.
Very clear. Can we avoid financial crisis and bubbles and boom bust cycles just by having a public money system that is not based of debt? Or should we also eliminate or regulate private debt money creation so that it doesn't happen?
You'll never eliminate debt. I mean, somebody can owe money to the grocery. Every economy works on credit to one way or another, and there's no way of avoiding credit. So the question is, who's the credit owed to? What you can do is to create the ability of banks to create credit, and that's what the 100% reserve theory is. Banks can make loans for purposes that the government says this is something worth making loans for on certain terms. And if the bank doesn't have the money to lend, the government will be the depositor in the banks. You'll turn the commercial banks into savings banks. You don't let them create the credit, and you don't let large amounts of savings accrue in the hands of an oligarchy. When you wipe out, there's so much credit and so much debt now that you have to wipe out the debt overhang or else you're going to have a depression. And that means the good part is you wipe out the savings. That's what you want to do. You want to wipe out the savings with a 1%. That is the equivalent of the bankers today and savers are financial sector are the equivalent of landlords in the 19th century. And that's what all of classical economics is about. How do we get rid of land rent? How do we get rid of the survival of feudalism in the form of landlords charging rent, the monopolies that bankers helped governments create to raise the money to pay their war debts, and banks themselves that have become the big rent recipients. You want to cancel the rent, and that means you have to make it a clean slate. And that's why what's so important today is discussing the idea of debt cancellations and clean slates. The Babylonians solved the problem. The West hasn't.
Mm-hmm. So many questions now. So I'll leave it there and hopefully I get answers later.
Mhm.
Great.
I keep getting new ideas as I think about it.
We'll have a good chance right away.
Yeah, the more questions you ask, the better once we get into that.
Good.
I guess the one thing to remind is that Temples of Enterprise is sort of the theoretical basis for what I describe historically in And Forgive Them Their Debts. So I have two treatments, the historical treatment, and then later my academic papers. And these are the academic papers discussing money and everything without a historical setting.
Okay. And resilience is clean slates, that whole thinking, and reciprocity is the idea of mutual aid, and that's where I got my thinking about the Siberian Yupik people, and to further emphasize that.
What I tried to do in in both my books was to the transition from anthropology and indigenous communities to a full-blown I won't say state because there wasn't a state as yet, but a full-blown organized society such as you had in the Bronze Age, the palatial economy, we'll call it.
Yes.
but the values remained the same, the values of mutual aid. And mutual aid was not only helping each other, the key is that it was to prevent predatory individuals from interfering with mutual aid by selfishly creating gains at the expense of the rest of the economy. That's what has to be stressed. The counter side of mutual aid, protection of the economy from the kind of oligarchy that developed in the West. I can see I'm going to be coughing.
Do you have some water?
I do have plenty of water.
Okay. Well, I mean, we're at 12:01 and
We can start.
it's growing every moment, but what do you think, Bo Young? Should we just get started then?